What if the most important battle of the 21st century is not being fought over oil, gold, or military power, but over something small enough to fit in the palm of a farmer's hand? Across the American Midwest, many farming communities continue to face uncertainty as trade disputes, changing export markets, and rising production costs reshape the agricultural landscape. Family farms that have survived for generations are asking difficult questions about the future, yet nearly 6,000 miles away, another story is quietly unfolding. In Burkina Faso, before sunrise, farmers gather around simple clay jars filled with seeds carefully preserved by their parents and grandparents. To many families, these are more than seeds. They represent memory, independence, and hope. While one part of the world is searching for ways to protect existing markets, another is asking a very different question. What if Africa could build its agricultural future using its own knowledge, its own land, and its own seeds? That question now sits at the heart of Burkina Faso's ambitious Seed Sovereignty Initiative, a strategy that supporters believe could reshape not only one nation's agriculture, but potentially influence conversations across the African continent about food security and economic independence. Imagine two farmers. One lives in Iowa, the other lives outside Ouagadougou. They have never met. They may never speak the same language. Yet the decisions made in their countries are becoming connected in ways neither could have imagined. If Africa's future matters to you, press like and stay with us, because tonight's story may change the way you think about food, freedom, and economic power. At first glance, this appears to be a story about agriculture, but before this journey ends, you may discover that it is really a story about sovereignty, identity, and a quiet shift in how nations imagine their future. And once the first seed is planted, history has a way of growing far beyond the field where it began. For many people, a seed is simply the beginning of a harvest. But for generations across Africa, a seed has represented something much greater. It carries memory, tradition, and the promise that a family can feed itself without depending entirely on forces beyond its control. Long before modern agricultural technology reached the Sahel, farming communities in what is now Burkina Faso carefully selected and preserved seeds that survived drought, harsh winds, and unpredictable rainfall. Grandparents taught their children which millet could endure the hottest seasons, which sorghum resisted pests, and which beans restored tired soil after difficult harvests. This knowledge was rarely written in books. It was passed from one generation to the next, field by field, season after season. Over time, however, agriculture changed around the world. Improved crop varieties, international seed companies, global trade, and modern farming technologies brought new opportunities to many countries. At the same time, they also increased farmers' reliance on commercial seed markets in many regions. Supporters argued these innovations could improve productivity. Critics questioned whether long-term dependence on imported inputs might reduce local resilience. Across parts of Africa, those questions became increasingly important. In villages across Burkina Faso, conversations slowly began to change. Farmers no longer asked only how much grain they would harvest next season. They also began asking another question: who controls the beginning of every harvest? That simple question gradually became part of a broader national discussion about food security, rural development, and economic resilience. Among those encouraging this discussion was Ibrahim Traoré, whose government has repeatedly emphasized greater national self-reliance across several sectors of the economy. Supporters of this approach argue that strengthening domestic agriculture is closely linked to strengthening national sovereignty. Others note that success will depend on long-term investment, research, and practical implementation. Regardless of political opinion, one fact remained clear: agriculture sits at the center of Burkina Faso's economy. Millions of livelihoods depend on healthy harvests. Every improvement in productivity affects families, schools, local markets, and national development. Every setback carries consequences that reach far beyond a single farming season. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, American agriculture has been navigating its own period of uncertainty, changing global demand, shifting trade relationships, weather extremes, and rising production costs have created difficult conditions for many producers. While American agriculture remains one of the world's largest and most technologically advanced sectors, farmers in several regions continue adapting to changing economic realities. The contrast is striking. In one part of the world, conversations often focus on protecting existing export markets. In another, discussions increasingly center on building greater local resilience. Neither challenge is simple. Both reflect different stages of economic development and different national priorities. Inside Burkina Faso, however, optimism began growing in unexpected places. At a small agricultural training center outside Bobo-Dioulasso, young researchers examined traditional seed varieties collected from surrounding villages. Some samples had been preserved by farming families for decades. Others represented crops that had gradually disappeared from commercial production but still survived in remote communities. The scientists were not trying to reject modern agricultural research. Instead, many hoped to combine scientific methods with local knowledge, improving productivity while preserving crops that were already adapted to local conditions. One researcher explained the goal in simple terms. The future does not have to erase the past. Sometimes the strongest innovation begins by understanding what previous generations already discovered. That philosophy resonated with many rural communities. In northern Burkina Faso, women responsible for preserving family seed collections described their work with quiet pride. Clay containers stored beneath their homes contained more than planting material. They represented family history. One elderly farmer smiled as she opened a weathered container. "My mother trusted these seeds," she said. "My grandmother trusted them before her. If they helped our family survive difficult years, they still deserve our respect today." Stories like hers rarely appear in international headlines, yet they help explain why discussions about seed sovereignty often carry emotional meaning that extends beyond economics. For many citizens, this conversation is not simply about agriculture. It is about confidence. Confidence that solutions can also emerge from local experience. Confidence that African researchers, engineers, and farmers can contribute ideas suited to African conditions. That confidence forms an important part of Burkina Faso's broader development narrative. As these conversations expanded, government officials announced plans aimed at strengthening domestic agricultural capacity. Public discussion increasingly focused on supporting research, improving seed preservation, expanding farmer training, and investing in local agricultural institutions. Supporters described these initiatives as foundations for long-term food security. Critics questioned whether sufficient financial resources and technical capacity would be available to achieve these ambitions. Those debates continue, but regardless of differing opinions, the direction of the national conversation had clearly shifted. Agriculture was no longer viewed only as a rural sector. It was increasingly discussed as part of national economic strategy. The proposed investment, estimated at roughly $900 million across multiple initiatives and partnerships, according to the concept discussed by supporters, came to symbolize more than funding alone. It represented ambition. Rather than focusing only on increasing annual harvests, the broader objective was to strengthen the institutions supporting agriculture itself. Seed preservation, agricultural research, farmer education, regional cooperation, climate resilience. Taken together, these efforts aim to reduce long-term vulnerability while encouraging greater domestic capacity. Young entrepreneurs saw opportunity. Agricultural students imagined new careers. Engineers discussed irrigation systems designed specifically for Sahel conditions. Local cooperatives explored ways to connect traditional farming knowledge with modern scientific research. For many observers inside Burkina Faso, the conversation had become larger than seeds. It was becoming a discussion about rebuilding confidence in national capability. Beyond Burkina Faso, analysts across Africa began watching with interest. Several countries already faced similar questions about food security, climate adaptation, and agricultural independence. While each nation has unique circumstances, the underlying challenge is shared by many developing economies. How can countries increase productivity while strengthening local resilience? How should governments balance international cooperation with domestic capacity? There are no simple answers, but Burkina Faso's debate added a new voice to that continental conversation. Some African commentators suggested that, if successful, aspects of Burkina Faso's approach might inspire similar discussions elsewhere. Others urged caution, emphasizing that every country must adapt agricultural policy to its own environmental, economic, and political realities. Even so, something had undeniably changed. For years, international observers often discussed Africa primarily as a destination for development programs or external investment. Increasingly, African policymakers, researchers, and entrepreneurs were presenting their own ideas for addressing local challenges. Whether every proposal succeeds is a question only time can answer, but the willingness to design those proposals locally marks an important shift in itself. Perhaps that is why this story continues attracting attention far beyond Burkina Faso, because beneath every discussion about seeds lies a much larger question. Who shapes the future of African agriculture? And perhaps more importantly, who should? As Burkina Faso's agricultural discussion gathered momentum, another question quietly began circulating beyond its borders. Could this become more than a national policy? Could it become part of a wider African conversation? Across the continent, agriculture remains one of the largest sources of employment and a foundation of economic stability. Yet many countries also face familiar challenges: climate variability, pressure on water resources, population growth, and changing international markets all influence what farmers can produce and how much they can earn. Because these challenges are shared, new ideas introduced in one country are often watched closely by others. In Ouagadougou, university lecture halls became places where students debated not only crop science but economic strategy. They discussed how stronger local seed systems might work alongside improved irrigation, better storage facilities, and expanded agricultural research. Their conversations reflected a broader question that many developing economies continue to explore. How can countries create more value from their own resources before looking abroad? For many young Burkinabe students, the answer began with confidence rather than technology. One graduate student studying agronomy explained it this way: when we believe innovation only comes from somewhere else, we stop looking for solutions in our own communities. That idea resonated with many young entrepreneurs. Some began developing digital tools to connect farmers with agricultural advisors. Others explored affordable irrigation systems designed specifically for local conditions. Small cooperatives experimented with improving storage methods to reduce post-harvest losses. None of these projects promised overnight transformation, but together they reflected a growing belief that lasting development often depends on strengthening many small pieces of the same system. Farmers noticed the difference as well. In villages surrounding Koudougou, local meetings increasingly focused on exchanging practical knowledge rather than waiting for outside assistance. Experienced growers compared planting calendars, rainfall observations, and traditional techniques that had helped families adapt during difficult seasons. The discussions were remarkably practical. How could soil retain moisture longer? Which crops tolerated shorter rainy seasons? How could neighboring communities cooperate during drought? These conversations rarely attracted international headlines, yet they illustrated an important point. Agricultural resilience is built gradually, through thousands of decisions made by ordinary people. Supporters of Burkina Faso's approach argue that strengthening local knowledge, research institutions, and farming communities creates a stronger foundation for future growth. Others caution that international partnerships, improved technology, and access to global markets will remain essential components of agricultural development. Rather than choosing one path exclusively, many experts suggest that the greatest progress may come from combining local experience with scientific research and international cooperation. Even so, the symbolism of Burkina Faso's initiative extended beyond technical policy. Across parts of Africa, commentators began asking whether greater food resilience could eventually support broader economic resilience. If countries produce more of what they consume, could they reduce costly imports? If farmers become more productive, could rural incomes improve? If agricultural processing expands locally, Could more value remain within national economies? These are questions that economists continue to debate. The answers will differ from country to country, but they demonstrate why agricultural policy often reaches far beyond the farm itself. Meanwhile, global markets continue changing. Supply chains have been tested by geopolitical tensions, extreme weather events, and shifting patterns of international trade. Governments around the world, from developed to developing economies, are increasingly discussing how to strengthen resilience against future disruptions. In that context, Burkina Faso's conversation about seed sovereignty became part of a much larger global trend. Many countries are asking similar questions. How much should essential food systems rely on international supply chains? How much capacity should remain at home? The balance between openness and self-reliance is different for every nation. For African policymakers, however, another opportunity also appeared: regional cooperation. The African Continental Free Trade Area has encouraged discussion about increasing trade among African economies. If agricultural production, food processing, and logistics continue improving across the continent, stronger regional markets could create new opportunities for farmers, businesses, and consumers alike. Some analysts believe that greater cooperation in agricultural research could accelerate progress. Universities could share expertise. Research institutes could exchange data. Farmers could learn from successful practices developed in neighboring countries. Others point out that such cooperation will require sustained investment, effective institution, and long-term political commitment. No single project can accomplish those goals alone. Yet, every larger transformation begins somewhere. Perhaps that explains why Burkina Faso's agricultural reforms continue attracting attention. Not because one initiative will solve every challenge, but because it reflects a broader determination to explore new approaches rooted in local priorities. For many citizens, this represents more than economic planning. It represents a change in mindset. A generation that once expected solutions to arrive from elsewhere is increasingly asking what solutions it can create itself. That shift cannot be measured only by budgets or production statistics. It can also be seen in classrooms where young scientists choose agricultural research, in workshops where engineers adapt machinery for local conditions, in villages where experienced farmers teach younger generations techniques refined over decades, and in families who believe that preserving knowledge can be just as important as preserving harvests. Whether Burkina Faso's approach ultimately becomes a model for other countries remains to be seen. Success will depend on many factors, including investment, governance, climate conditions, research capacity, and continued cooperation with regional and international partners. But one thing is already clear: the conversation has expanded far beyond one country's borders. It has become part of a larger discussion about how Africa can strengthen food security, encourage innovation, and shape its own development in a rapidly changing world. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the first sign of transformation is not a dramatic announcement. It is a quiet change in the questions people begin asking. And across Burkina Faso today, more people are asking not only how to harvest the next season, but how to build the next generation. When historians look back at periods of major economic change, they often find that the turning point was not a single speech, a single law, or a single leader. It was a change in mindset. For Burkina Faso, the discussion surrounding seed sovereignty may ultimately be remembered in that way, not because every objective will necessarily be achieved exactly as planned, not because every challenge will disappear, but because it encouraged a broader national conversation about what long-term development should look like. Supporters see an opportunity to strengthen local agriculture, expand scientific research, and improve food security through greater domestic capacity. Others emphasize that success will require consistent investment, transparent institution, reliable infrastructure, and continued cooperation with international partners. Both perspectives point toward the same reality. Agricultural transformation is measured in years, not weeks. Harvests cannot be rushed. Neither can institutions. Yet throughout Burkina Faso, many people appear willing to think beyond the next growing season. In rural communities, farmers continue experimenting with cultivation methods that combine inherited knowledge with modern research. At universities, young scientists study crop resilience, irrigation, and soil management with the hope of solving problems specific to the Sahel. Small businesses explore opportunities in food processing, storage, and agricultural services that could create additional employment within local communities. Each individual effort may appear modest. Together, they represent something much larger, a belief that long-term prosperity begins with strengthening the foundations of the economy rather than depending entirely on external solutions. Across Africa, similar conversations are taking place. Countries with different climates, different resources, and different political systems are all searching for ways to increase productivity while building resilience against future uncertainty. Some will pursue larger investments in agricultural technology. Others may focus on irrigation, transport, education, or regional trade. There is no single model that fits every nation, but the willingness to develop solutions that reflect local priorities has become an increasingly visible part of the continent's economic conversation. International observers are watching closely for the same reason. Agriculture influences far more than food production. It affects employment, public health, trade, manufacturing, education, and national stability. When agricultural systems become stronger, the effects often extend into many other sectors of society. When they struggle, those challenges can spread just as quickly. That is why discussions about seeds, research, and farming continue to receive attention from economists, development specialists, and policymakers around the world. For Burkina Faso, the coming years will provide the clearest answers. Can research institutions continue expanding? Will farmers have access to the knowledge and resources they need? Can productivity improve while protecting natural resources? Will regional cooperation create new opportunities for agricultural trade? Those questions remain open. Their answers will depend not only on government policy, but also on the work of researchers, entrepreneurs, farming communities, educators, and regional partners. Perhaps that is the most encouraging lesson within this story. Real transformation is rarely the result of one decision alone. It grows through thousands of choices made by ordinary people who decide that the future can be built one season at a time. Some will save seeds, others will improve irrigation, some will teach the next generation, others will develop new technologies inspired by local conditions. Together, those efforts shape a country's future more quietly than headlines often suggest. Whether Burkina Faso's approach ultimately becomes a model for other African nations is a question that only time can answer. What is already evident, however, is that the conversation has expanded well beyond agriculture. It now touches ideas of resilience, innovation, economic development, and national confidence. And perhaps that is why this story resonates with so many people, because every nation, regardless of geography or income, eventually faces the same question. How do we build a future that is both productive and sustainable for the generations that follow? For Burkina Faso, one possible answer begins in the field, with the hands of farmers, the work of researchers, and the determination of communities that believe lasting progress starts from the ground up. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. If you found this analysis valuable, we'd like to hear your perspective. Do you think greater investment in local agricultural capacity can strengthen long-term food security in Africa? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy thoughtful analysis on Burkina Faso, African development, and international affairs, consider subscribing so you can join us for future conversations.